Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new around here, then you should know that I like to do Genshin content. Make sure to check out my other videos if Genshin content interests you, and consider subscribing if you like what you see. Anyway, in this video, I'm going to be giving my thoughts and my first impressions on Albedo. We're going to do some quick calculations, and also I'm going to let you know where I think he will go in the future. So we're going to go over what role I think he excels the best in, his damage output, his energy generation, his resource cost to make him usable. I'm going to clear up some misconceptions about Geo Rxns. I'm going to try to answer the question if he's worthy of being a 5-star, and whether or not he's worth your Primogems. Additionally, this video is going to assume that you do already have a basic understanding of his kit, because I won't be going over the basics of his abilities. Alright, let's go. So Miho classifies Albedo as a support character, but you know, they also called Zhongli a hybrid DPS support character, and look how that turned out. Not too well. But thankfully, this time around, I think I can agree with them. So Albedo's support slash off-field damage is really good when we build him for crit. He really does do a lot of damage comparatively to other off-field damage dealers, and if we include his elemental mastery buff, I think that he fulfills the support role very well, because he's just going to further boost your team's damage. This elemental mastery buff, I think, is a very underrated passive talent that a lot of people aren't really talking about right now. It's really hard to quantify elemental mastery damage, so I'll try to quantify that for you guys as we go through this video. Okay, so now let's talk about his damage output. I'm going to ignore his normal and charge attacks because we've classified Albedo as a support character, so he's not really going to be doing any of his normal or charge attacks. Alright, his E skill. His E skill is the Solar Isotoma, as we all know, and it is going to proc a Transient Blossom whenever you deal damage to an enemy. This skill is going to scale off his defense, which means that we don't really care about the base attack of our weapon. This skill has really good scaling, and since it's based off of Albedo's defense, he's able to dish out very good damage. Albedo's base defense is one of the highest in the game. This skill is basically the crux of this character, and for most support builds, we're going to be building him for defense so that we can get the most out of this skill. Albedo's Q skill, his Elemental Burst, deals very decent burst damage and will spawn 7 Fatal Blossoms whenever you use this when your Solar Isotoma is on the field. The Fatal Blossoms are quite random when they generate, and very rarely are you going to hit a single enemy with all 7 of the Fatal Blossoms. They do, however, like to converge mostly where there are enemies, so it's not 100% random, but basically this is not quite a Ningguang ult where all of her gems will home in on the enemy, so don't think of it in that way. Albedo's passive skills are really good. They really help boost his own damage and his team's damage. So his first passive skill is that he deals 25% more damage with his E, his Solar Isotoma, if the enemy has less than 50% HP. His other passive talent is that he grants 125 Elemental Mastery, like I mentioned before, to all of your party members whenever he casts his ultimate. But exactly how much damage is 125 Elemental Mastery? So with characters that have 0 Elemental Mastery, a Vaporize or Melt damage is going to increase by another 23%. Transformative reactions like Electro Charge and Overload will deal approximately 53% more damage. Elemental Mastery doesn't scale quite linearly, but if your character has between somewhere in the range of 100 to 125 Elemental Mastery already on them, then they're going to get a boost of 40% in their amped reactions and 98% for their transformative reactions. That's a pretty good damage boost if you ask me, and it's a passive skill that I think that a lot of people aren't really talking about. So next up is his energy generation. So Albedo's E skill does not generate any elemental particles when you deal the summoning damage. They will only generate particles when you deal transient blossom damage. But this is very good since this is all off-field energy generation. However, every time you proc a transient blossom, it is not a 100% chance to generate an elemental particle. I haven't thoroughly tested it myself, but it definitely does seem like it's above 50% chance to generate a elemental particle. But at the same time, it feels kind of front-loaded. And so what I mean by that is that it feels like the first couple of hits always seems to give me energy, and then later on, they don't proc energy generation as often. This is probably just bias and probably just completely random, but that's just the way that it feels to me. But I think the important thing to know is that every time you proc a Transient Blossom is when you have a chance to generate a elemental particle. Also, Transient Blossoms will only proc when you deal damage to an enemy, and there are enemies with shields where you don't actually deal damage. So these are enemies like the Abyss Mages and the Cryo and Geo Slimes. So in a matchup where you are only facing Abyss Mages, Albedo's not going to be as strong because he can't proc any Transient Blossoms and generate any energy for his team. Most of the time though, there are going to be enemies without shields so that you can still proc the Blossoms, but again, there are situations where only Abyss Mages spawn. So again, that's not going to be a good matchup for Albedo. And this is really unfortunate because other skills, when they come into contact with an Abyss Mage's shield, like Goba, still generate elemental particles. So the fact that we just can't proc the Transient Blossoms when we hit the shield is what hurts Albedo's energy generation. There are also other types of shields like the Fatui shields that just reduce damage, so we can still proc Transient Blossoms on those types of enemies. This means that Albedo has a chance to generate an elemental particle once every 2 seconds, but it's going to also have its own limitations when it comes to shields. Next, let's talk about Albedo's resource cost to make him a worthwhile and usable character to be used on your team. So I think that Albedo is a very easy character to invest into, unlike other characters. We'll get his full set unlocked once we ascend him to Ascension Phase level 4 and get him up to level 60. Of course, you'll be getting much more damage at higher levels and at higher Ascension levels, but he's still doing impressive damage just at level 60 and Ascension Phase 4. He also really likes defense percent artifacts and defense substats, so you know, we've been farming artifacts these past couple of weeks, past couple of months, and we typically don't like artifacts that roll these defense substats, but with Albedo, he can definitely use those artifacts. So those artifacts that you originally thought were trash can actually be really good for him. Albedo also loves the Harbinger of Dawn 3-star weapon because this is going to boost his crit damage and his crit rate. Since Albedo's E skill does not scale off of his attack, we don't really care about the base attack of the 3-star weapon. We simply level it up so that we can get as much crit damage as we can. And then as long as we're keeping Albedo at above 90% HP, we're going to get a free 28% crit rate once you've refined your Harbinger of Dawn to refine level 5. That's why when you try to use Albedo as a main DPS, things get kind of weird. Both of his skills are going to scale both off of his attack and his defense, so you'll have to either sacrifice your defense to bolster his ult damage and his normal attack damage, or sacrifice the damage on his normal attacks and burst to increase the damage on your elemental skill damage. Albedo also doesn't really benefit from his elemental mastery buff because Geo can only create crystallized reactions, so that means you're only going to be improving your damage absorption. In other words, you're going to be getting the most damage for the least amount of resources if you build Albedo for his E skill. Okay, now I want to clear up some misconceptions about the Geo reaction. So a lot of people have been saying that Albedo will consume your elements and will not allow your team to capitalize on elemental reactions. But this is not the case because Geo reactions don't actually consume the element they react with. They are just going to reduce the time that they stay on the enemy. They don't completely consume the element. It's only going to take a static amount of time away. So if an element has been on an enemy for a while without any other reactions on it, and then you apply Geo, then that element will go away. But if you apply it instantly, then you get a little bit extra time to create more reactions. So thanks to how the Transient Blossoms work, whenever you apply damage, the Transient Blossom will also apply its Geo damage at the same time. So that means this reaction happens instantly, giving you a little bit more time to create other reactions. Okay, now is Albedo worth being a 5-star? So what better way to answer this question than comparing his performance to 4-star characters, other off-field damage 4-star characters. So I'm going to compare him to a Fischl, and a Xingqiu. I'm going to use builds that are as close to each other as possible because we want to compare the results with the same amount of investment. Obviously, if you invest more in your character, then they will outperform the other. So by doing it this way, we can see how they perform relative to each other with the same amount or relatively similar amount of investment. I'm going to be using level 6 talent scaling since this is the most accessible talent level for most players. It doesn't require any weekly boss drops and only requires Ascension Phase 4. I will also be using level 70 weapons. So first, let's just verify that I'm actually doing my calculations correctly. We can see the damage that Albedo is doing to this Ruin Guard on the screen right now, and then we can compare that to the damage that I calculated in my spreadsheet. In the video, I used a plus 13 5-star crit damage circlet, but for most of the calculations that we're going to be doing in the spreadsheet, I'm going to be using a plus 12 5-star crit damage circlet. So we can see that my calculations are pretty much on point here. We're off by 1 damage, probably due to a rounding error. So let's take a look at the numbers and break it down. So again, remember that the characters are going to be level 60, Ascension Phase 4, all of their artifacts are at plus 12, and their weapon is at level 70. The top is Fischl, the middle is Xingqiu, and then on the bottom here we have Albedo when the enemy is at above 50% HP, and then Albedo's damage when the enemy is below 50% HP. So first off, let's take a look at the differences between each of the characters when it comes to their numbers. So for Fischl, she's going to have lower crit damage because of the fact that the bows don't have the same effect as the Harbinger of Dawn, giving us an extra 38% crit damage. Xingqiu has a little bit extra damage bonus percent because one of his passive talents is going to give him 20% extra hydro damage bonus. And then over here when it comes to Albedo, our weapon attack is 0 because that doesn't factor into the skill damage for his E, and the damage bonus percent on the bottom is an extra 25% due to Albedo's passive skill, doing extra 25% damage whenever the enemy has less than 50% HP. So let's first take a look at the differences between Fischl and Albedo. So Albedo is actually losing to Fischl's damage output without crit. His base damage is actually underperforming Fischl's damage. However, when Albedo crits, then he wins in terms of damage. Okay, now you might be wondering why I'm saying that when clearly Albedo's damage is 986 and Fischl's damage is 517. This is because Oz actually shoots faster than Albedo can proc Transient Blossoms. So remember, Transient Blossom can only occur once every 2 seconds, but Oz is able to shoot once every second. So we multiply her base damage by 2, and she just barely edges out Albedo's damage. Now when it comes to energy regen, Fischl's energy regen within a 10-second time frame can on average be more than Albedo's, because each time Oz hits an enemy, he has about a 60% chance to generate an elemental particle. Coupled with the fact that Fischl can reset Oz's timer with well-timed bursts, she has near 100% uptime with Oz even at C0. Whereas Albedo is only generating an elemental particle once every 2 seconds based off a similar chance. So it seems like Albedo is losing to Fischl in every regard except for the crit damage. Albedo really shines when it comes to the crit damage due to the Harbinger of Dawn's extra crit damage percent. He also barely edges out Fischl's damage when he is damaging enemies that are below 50% HP. You can see that he's doing almost 1200 damage and then almost 3k crit damage to enemies below 50%. So when it comes to base damage, Albedo slightly loses at enemies above 50% HP and then slightly wins against opponents below 50% HP, but Albedo is going to win when it comes to crit damage. However, if you level up your Albedo up to Ascension Phase 6 and get him up to level 80, he is going to win in terms of all types of damage. Okay, so now let's compare him with Xingqiu. With Xingqiu, his Q alternates between firing 2 swords and 3 swords. Although I have his C1, so I'm not sure if this changes when he's at C0. He's going to fire his sword whenever the active character does a normal attack. It does have an internal cooldown, however, so it doesn't fire if your normal attacks are too fast. Basically, we'll get 5 swords to fire every 2 seconds. So that means we multiply his base damage by 5 to get an equivalent comparison to Albedo's damage. So unfortunately, Albedo loses to Xingqiu in terms of base damage here as well. But what about crit? When it comes to crit, Xingqiu's crit damage is a little bit bit more nuanced because each sword will crit individually. So that means this is going to be pure RNG whether or not Xingqiu does more damage than Albedo. So although Xingqiu does more damage with his burst, this is obviously a downside because Xingqiu needs to use his burst in order to get this damage, whereas Albedo's damage comes simply from his E and has nearly 100% uptime. If Xingqiu is using the Harbinger of Dawn, that means that he is not going to be invested into energy recharge, which means that the uptime on his burst is going to be very low. Basically what this means is that in the long run, Albedo is going to out damage Xingqiu, as well as the fact that Xingqiu does not generate energy for his team while his burst is active. So on paper, Xingqiu is doing more damage, but in practice, he's not actually. And then one more thing to remember is that Albedo is doing AoE geo damage, whereas the other characters, Fischl and Xingqiu, are only doing single target damage. So that means against large groups of enemies, Albedo is going to vastly surpass these two in terms of damage. But against single target enemies, Albedo does just as well or a little bit worse than these two characters. So do I think Albedo is worth your Primogems? I don't think he's worth it if you're looking for the next OP character. He's a good character, but he's not amazing by any stretch. He fills his support role really well. I say that if you like his design, his playstyle, and have a good spot on your team for Geo, then I'd say go ahead and pull for him. Because remember that he struggles against certain matchups. He is not that great against enemies that have damage nullifying shields and against single target enemies. His base damage is kind of on par to Fischl's, but I think this more just reveals that Fischl is a really good character. Since we can build Albedo for crit so easily, I would say that he is one of the best off-field damage dealers in the game right now. So if you have room on your team for another off-field damage dealer and a Geo character at that, then I'd say pull for him. But if you're not really interested in that, then I would skip. Although I do have to say that he will open up lots of new team compositions that revolve around the 4-piece Bolide set, since he generates crystallized reactions basically every 2 seconds, giving your active character a 40% increase to their normal and charged attacks. Albedo is also just going to get better with the new Geo Resonance buffs, so if you plan to run double Geo, Albedo is just going to get better. And his last passive talent allows you to save some resin. He can give you double the weapon materials when crafting. That might just be enough to push you over the edge to pull for him, because sometimes you can get double golds, and no one's gonna complain about that. Anyway, that's it for my first impressions and analysis for Albedo. If you guys liked what you saw, then please leave me a like and consider subscribing to the channel. I plan to do a couple more comparisons for Albedo, so if you wanna know when I drop those videos, then you know what to do. Alright guys, I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.